Update 2. My dad locked my sister in her room for disrespecting the badge, then made her serve dinner to the cop who touched me. When I finally told him what Vance did, he didn't even look at me. He just said, "Vance is friendly like that. Stop being dramatic." I stayed silent. That was 4 months ago. Last night, he sat in the dark, flipping through her notebook for hours and didn't notice he was crying until Mom brought him tissues. Inside were things I didn't expect: a small digital recorder, a disposable camera, a notebook filled with dates and times. She explained she'd been documenting everything since that day at the park. Every time Vance showed up at my school, every weird comment, every too long touch. She'd even taken pictures of his patrol car parked outside places I went. The notebook had it all written down in her neat handwriting. But she said it wasn't enough. Dad would just say Vance was being protective, that we were reading into innocent behavior. She needed something more concrete. I'm really curious about how Raven started keeping all those records in that shoebox. The recorder, camera, and notebook with dates and times. What made her think to start collecting evidence like that? Something Dad couldn't explain away. Her eyes met mine, and I knew what she was thinking before she said it. The next day after school, I didn't take any detours. I walked straight to the corner store where I always bought candy. Just like Raven predicted, Vance showed up within minutes. He came up behind me while I was looking at the candy display and put both hands on my shoulders. He leaned down close to my ear and asked what looked good today. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes. I pointed at the Skittles with a shaky finger. He reached over me to grab them, pressing against my back longer than necessary. At the register, he paid like always and handed me the candy. Outside the store, he suggested we take the scenic route home. Through the park, he said. More trees, prettier walk. I nodded because what else could I do? As we walked, he kept his hand on my lower back, occasionally sliding it down further before moving it back up. In the park, he steered me toward a bench surrounded by bushes, the same area where the playground used to be before they tore it down. He sat and patted the spot next to him. I sat on the very edge, ready to run. He scooted closer until our legs touched. That's when Raven appeared from behind the bushes with a disposable camera. The flash went off 3 times before Vance even realized what was happening. He jumped up, his face turning red, then purple. He lunged for the camera, but Raven was already running. I ran too, in the opposite direction like we'd planned. I heard Vance yelling behind us, but didn't look back. My feet pounded the pavement and my chest burned, but I kept running. I burst through our front door and ran straight to Mom, who was folding laundry in the living room. I collapsed against her, gasping for air. She held me and asked what was wrong. Before I could answer, Raven flew through the door and slammed it behind her. She was breathing hard, too, but she had this wild look in her eyes, like she'd won something. Mom demanded to know what was going on. That's when Dad's car pulled into the driveway. Then another patrol car, then another. Within minutes, our living room was full of uniforms. Vance pushed through them all, pointing at Raven and yelling about assault and harassment. Dad's face was stone as he looked between us. Vance told his version first. How he was just walking me home safely when Raven attacked him. How she'd been stalking him for weeks, taking pictures and making up lies. How she was trying to destroy his reputation because he'd caught her friend Celeste shoplifting months ago. Dad turned to Raven and asked for the camera. She shook her head. He asked again, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone. Still, she refused. He stepped forward and I thought he might grab her, but Mom put her hand on his arm. The other officers started murmuring about pressing charges, about how Raven was almost 18, about how this was clearly harassment of a fellow officer. Vance nodded along, playing the victim perfectly. He even managed to look hurt, like Raven had deeply wounded him. That's when I found my voice. I told them about the corner store, the walks home, the park bench, the way he touched me, how he said things about my body, how he compared me to Raven when she was younger. The words tumbled out faster and faster until I was almost screaming. The room went silent. Dad's face cycled through emotions I couldn't name. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Vance's mask slipped for just a second and I saw something dark flash across his face. Then he schooled his expression back to wounded innocence. He shook his head sadly and said, I was clearly confused, that Raven had filled my head with lies, that I was just a kid who didn't understand that friendly behavior wasn't inappropriate. He turned to Dad and said he was sorry his daughters had turned out this way. Dad's jaw tightened. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in weeks. Then his gaze shifted to Raven, who stood defiant with her chin raised. The camera was clutched tight in her hands. The other officers waited for Dad to say something, to pick a side. Finally, Dad spoke. He said this was clearly a family matter that had gotten out of hand, that emotions were running high, that everyone needed to cool down. He suggested the other officers leave so we could sort this out privately. They hesitated, but Dad used his sergeant voice, and they filed out one by one. Vance was the last to go. He paused at the door and looked back at us, at me specifically. His eyes promised this wasn't over, that there would be consequences. Then he smiled at Dad, all friendly again, and said he'd see him at work tomorrow. When the door closed, Dad turned on us. But before he could speak, Raven held up the camera and said she had proof, that the pictures would show exactly what kind of man Vance really was. Dad demanded she hand it over. She took a step back toward the stairs. Mom finally spoke up. She said, maybe we should all sit down and talk about this calmly. That clearly something had happened to upset us girls, that we were family and could work through anything. But her voice wavered like she wasn't sure she believed her own words. We sat around the dining room table, the same table where Vance had threatened Raven with jail time, where he'd circled her like prey. Mom made tea that nobody drank. Dad drummed his fingers on the wood, a habit that meant he was thinking hard. Raven went first. She told them everything, starting with a police picnic when she was 14. How Vance had cornered her behind the storage shed. How he'd put his hand over her mouth. How she'd fought and scratched but he was too strong. How he'd whispered that nobody would believe her. Dad's drumming stopped. His face went pale, then flushed red. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. I reached for Raven's hand under the table and squeezed. She squeezed back and kept talking about how she'd run to Dad with grass stains and tears. How he'd called her a liar. She talked about the months after. How Vance would smirk at her at family gatherings. How he'd make little comments when nobody else was listening. How she'd tried to never be alone, but sometimes it was impossible. How she'd been terrified when she saw him starting the same pattern with me. When she finished, the room was thick with silence. Mom was crying quietly. Dad stared at the table like it held answers. I wanted to say something, but my throat felt closed up. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Dad finally lifted his head from the table. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee mug, then pulled back without touching it. Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue and looked between Raven and me. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, each note hanging heavy in the air. Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced to the window, then back to the table. His face had gone from red to an ashy gray. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. Mom reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Raven stayed perfectly still, her spine straight, and her eyes fixed on Dad. I could feel her hand still gripping mine under the table. Her palm was sweaty, but her grip was steady. She'd said what needed saying, and now we waited. Dad finally spoke, his voice raw. He asked Raven why she never told him the truth about the picnic, why she let him think she was lying all these years. His words came out broken, like each one hurt to say. Raven's grip on my hand tightened. She explained that she had told him, that she'd run to him, crying with dirt on her clothes and Vance's skin under her nails, that she'd begged him to believe her, but he'd chosen his partner over his daughter. He'd made her apologize to the man who hurt her. Dad's whole body seemed to deflate. He sank back into his chair and put his head in his hands. Mom moved closer to him, but he shook her off. The silence stretched on until I thought I might scream just to break it. Then Dad's phone rang. The sharp sound made us all jump. He looked at the screen and his face went even paler. It was Vance. Dad let it ring until it went to voicemail. A moment later, a text came through. Then another and another. Dad read them silently, his jaw working. Whatever Vance was saying, it wasn't good. Dad set the phone face down on the table and looked at Raven. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. His eyes were wet. He asked to see the camera. Raven hesitated, then slid it across the table. Dad picked it up carefully like it might explode.